Hi everyone, you're listening to Bookworms being broadcast to you today on Arrow 92.7 FM, your community access radio channel, and Wairarapa TV on Freeview Channel 41. This program is broadcast live every other Tuesday at 3 p.m. and repeated on the Tuesdays in between at 3 p.m. Now, over the course of the next 30 minutes, we'll read you some literary items that we've enjoyed recently, or not recently, as the case may be, or enjoyed, or not enjoyed, or hated, which we hope you'll find interesting. My name is Steve Lilliston, and with me today is Graham Bernard.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Graham. How you doing, mate? Good. Say hello to the nice people.
Hello, nice people.
There you go. Okay, so today I'm going to look at Owen Marshall, and Graham is going to look at a book written by a survivor of the Titanic, I understand. So, okay, let's just get into it then. So I'd like to talk about Owen Marshall Jones, aged 87, writes under the pen name Owen Marshall, and he's a New Zealand short story writer and novelist. I must admit, I don't tend to read Kiwi writers. Do you read much?
No, not really.
No.
I mean, plays that I've done.
Yeah.
But no, not.
No.
I went to Booktown and I went to an interview with Fiona Kidman, and she's intrigued me enough to.
She's a lovely writer. Yeah. Interesting. I not that I've purposely steered away from them, but you tend to read, I don't know, blockbusters, and you don't sort of associate Kiwi writers with blockbusters. But Owen Marshall, I picked him up the other day, and he was very heavy, but I put him down again very quickly. And and it turns out that he's a fantastic writer. I really love his work. He's an award-winning novelist, short story writer, poet, anthologist, and he's written and edited 30 books, including the best-selling novel The Lanarks. Numerous awards for his fiction include the New Zealand Literary Fund Scholarship in Letters, fellowships at Otago and Canterbury Universities, and the Catherine Mansfield Memorial Fellowship in Menton, France.
I've never heard of him.
No, exactly. Terrible to admit, isn't it? But I really haven't. Anyway, many, many more prizes that he's won, distinctions. This particular book, I saw a review of Carnival Sky, and so I picked it up. And I just absolutely loved it. I thought it was the most fantastic book. It revolves around one character who's a disillusioned journalist, and he's got plans to travel overseas. He's just chucked in his job, but first he goes down south to Alexandria, where his father is dying, and he becomes caught up with the family in the agonizing inertia of waiting for approaching death. So he's there with his sister. He's in his 40s, early 40s, and his sister's about the same age. So in this particular sequence, I'd love to read you. He's talking with his sister Georgie, who's a doctor, about the pain that their father Warwick is suffering. So she's not treating him, but she's there while he's going through the last stages of his terminal cancer. And how hard it is for them to watch him go through it. So that's just to set the stage a bit. So she's Georgie. So she says, well, I could do something. She says so quietly that Chef found it difficult to hear because of traffic noise reverberating from the walls of the cutting that led down to the bridge. What do you mean? He found himself attempting to adjust his longer step to that of his sister. You know what I mean. I can help him go. But you'd have to agree, I can't carry it all by myself. They were above the water and stopped walking because of the almost brutal impact of what they had considered. Brother and sister standing together on a neutral metal walkway with the sinuous Clutha, like a giant jade water snake passing underneath, and the pigeons shuffling in the niches of the old stone bridge supports, abandoned close downstream, and talking of taking their father's life. Nothing in the scene around them reflected the enormity of that. One pale cloud slowly altered form. The steepest slopes had a metallic glint. The willows and poplars along the riverbank showed no agitation. A ute was parked off the bridge not far ahead of them with the driver still in it. He was using a cell phone and his bare right arm made a protruding triangle from the window, a very hairy arm and thin. Chef felt a sudden jag within himself, part relief and part grief. Relief that maybe there was a way to free his father from agony and degradation. Grief that they need consider it. Well, what about Mum? No, she couldn't stand it, said Georgie, beginning to walk again. It wouldn't be fair. When they were level with the ute driver, he drew his arm in, his call finished, started the engine, and did a U-turn in front of them despite other traffic. He looked at them for a moment as he passed. Perhaps there was something in their postures or expressions that hinted at a moment of significance. More likely he was preoccupied with his own life and wondered if they were people he knew. He had long blonde hair drawn back in a ponytail, like a bikie in an American road movie. We couldn't say anything at all to her, said Georgie. Only you and I would know. Well, hell, Georgie, you could be for the high jump. Your whole career down the tubes. Nothing much would happen to me. You don't have to do it for me. It would be for Dad. But I need you absolutely in agreement. I couldn't carry it alone for the rest of my life. Christ, though. I won't even consider it unless you're with me, she said as they approached the shops. I know what Dad wants, said Chef. He could feel tears on his face, but didn't raise a hand. We put him first, or we put ourselves first. That's the guts of it. How would it happen? You needn't know about any of that, she said, but otherwise it's likely to drag on. Anyway, you think about it and tell me tonight. I tell you now. He wants to go, Chef said. If we can help him this last time, then we should. Okay then, if you're sure, then it's settled. And she put her hand out to halt him. For a moment he wondered why. Then she put her arms around him in a loose hug, and he responded in the same way. It seemed they stood together there in the street for a long time, but there was no awkwardness and no concern for anyone who might be watching. Just the two of them, united in the decision.
I bet that scenario goes on every day in every hospital around the world.
Yeah, exactly. But isn't that lovely, that the imagery? Did you get the imagery?
Yeah.
And when I read that, being a Kiwi New Age male, it didn't affect me a bit. Of course it did. I must admit, when I read that, it brought me to tears. I just thought it was marvellous.
You kind of felt like you were standing next to them, watching them.
Yeah.
And understanding what this terrible turmoil they were going through.
Yeah.
And doing it because they loved their father, obviously.
Yes, it's all for love, isn't it? So, yeah.
So, do you think there's some autobiographical stuff in there?
I didn't see any of that. I read a little bit about the making of the book, and it didn't mention that.
Right.
But I wouldn't be at all surprised. He must.
And you said he's quite old, in his 80s.
He's 78.
Right.
Yeah.
So he's still alive.
Yeah, still writing. In fact, was that his latest book? I think that was his latest book. It's really, really stunning, really powerful. And I've read another couple of his books. I must read the Lanarks, because that's the story of the Lanarks is a fabulous story, Kiwi story. Lanark Castle.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
We call it Larnack.
Larnack. Oh God.
I think there's an R in there.
Larnack. Yeah.
Do you want to tell us what happened, or should we read the book?
No, I better not spoil it.
Okay.
I better not spoil it. It is a lovely story. It's one of those when it's very. I find it very rich because of the descriptions. And as to what happens, it's life-changing for him. Of course it's life-changing because his father died. But it does change his whole vision, his whole look on life, and how he relates to his mother and his sister, and how it affects where he goes from there, what he does from there. So it's a lovely story about people. And,
People who have who are in turmoil at the moment about whether they believe in this right to life bill that's at Parliament at the moment, maybe should read it. It might help them make a decision.
Right. Yeah, so I think the father asked, he asked the son, Chef, asked him to help him go.
Right.
And Chef couldn't do that at that stage. It was actually the daughter, the doctor, that helps him go.
The practical one.
Yeah, the practical one.
Yeah.
And that's the big thing, the sibling rivalry there too, because she's the younger one, and she's a very, very successful, very highly thought of doctor, works in Auckland, and he is like a scruffy journalist type, bolshy and just an annoying guy, and he's not sure what's going on. As I say, he chucks his job, so what his future holds, he's not sure. His parents nearly didn't think nearly so much of him as they did of her. So all that sibling rivalry stuff, and it's really interesting how it plays out. They spend time together. But,
and interesting, the daughter or his sister, who's the doctor, who signed the Hippocratic Oath, no doubt, to be a doctor,
right,
is the one that instigates this decision they make.
Right. Well, you hear that it happens a lot. I mean, just to give them a little nudge, it's not, they're dying. God, I mean, they've got a couple of days, maybe a week to go. Really, what's the point, And if everything is right, why not give them a little bit extra morphine or whatever it was. An interesting story about life.
Nice.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, Graham, for something completely different.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, it's couldn't be more different to your story. This is a book called Titanic Survivor, written by a woman who was a stewardess on board. She was called Violet Jessop. Now, she wrote memoirs. Well, she wrote a manuscript, and I think she wrote it as a diary. And it wasn't published until after she died. Her nieces found it in her private effects, in her personal effects, and they knew that she had survived the Titanic, but didn't realise that she had written this story. And they sent it off to a publisher, and it was published in 1997, so a long time after the actual event.
Yeah. So she kept a daily diary from.
She kept a daily diary.
From the age of.
She was. This is just about the Titanic, but her first voyage as a stewardess was in October 1908. She was 21. The Titanic was her 25th voyage as a stewardess. 2 months after the Titanic went down, she was back at sea on a new ship. And from then she did 171 voyages. Wow. Mainly across the Atlantic, so the liners going between London and New York. But she did some round-the-world trips. She did trips down to Africa and the West Indies and Australia. And her last journey was in June 1950. So it was a career for her.
Yeah.
She was brought up by Irish parents, but brought up in Argentina. And her father died young, and she became the main breadwinner. So I just want to read a little message she puts in the front, which I think is quite poignant, because this is how she survived the Titanic, really. And she says, "In number 7 boat, I saw one child, a baby boy with a small woolen cap. After getting all the women that were there, they called out 3 times, Mr. Ismay twice, in a loud voice, 'Are there any more women before this boat goes?' And there was no answer. Mr. Murdoch called out, and at that moment a female came up whom he did not recognise. Mr. Ismay said, 'Come along, jump in.' She said, 'I am only a stewardess.' And he said, 'Never mind, you are a woman. Now take your place in the boat.'" And that was her.
That was her.
That was her. Mr. Ismay was the executive of the shipping company, because this was their maiden voyage.
Right.
And he was the highest ranking executive to survive the journey. And there was a lot of furore afterwards that he had survived and jumped into a lifeboat ahead of passengers. And he spent the rest of his life being ridiculed, and it was a terrible time for him. The first little part I'd like to read is her on board the ship greeting the passengers who are coming into her cabins that she looks after. And some of them she recognises from previous journeys. So she says here, it was not surprising when John Astor, who was one from the famous Astor family, brought his bride on board. They had just got married. This was their honeymoon. About whom there had been so much publicity. Instead of the radiant woman of my imagination, one who had succeeded in overcoming much opposition and marrying the man she wanted, I saw a quiet, pale, sad-faced, in fact dull young woman arrive listlessly on the arm of her husband, apparently indifferent to everything about her. It struck me for the first time that all the wealth in the world did not make for inward contentment. Privately, I was satisfied that I had withstood the allure of a beautiful home in Cuba for the love of a pair of quizzical eyes. It's a lovely way of saying that she had adventure in her blood and she wanted to leave. My daydreaming ended with the further arrival of passengers. My heart sank as Mrs. Cyrus Clapton, clutching her pet Pekingese, bore down towards my section, followed by a downcast maid. She had invariably reduced each successive maid to submission as she boarded the ship. Their spirits would finally be broken by a combination of Mrs. Clapton and the rough sea voyage. I reflected that although in my many ways my job was not that prestigious, but I can consider myself lucky when I looked at that maid and saw what her position had done to her. She then mentions a couple of young men who arrived, and then she says, suddenly, like the meteoric person she was, Miss Marcia Spatz arrived. All packages, hat boxes and flowers galore. Never-ending boxes of flowers from innumerable sources, presumably thank offerings to mark her departure. She came with her habitually determined look, meaning to get service from the start. She'd encountered her on previous journeys.
Right.
On these occasions, I pulled out the register of my patience to its fullest capacity, knowing I would need all my reserve before the day was over. I went forward to greet her. She appeared surprised to see me, registering both pleasure and annoyance. Probably pleased because she would have someone who understood her many and strange needs, and yet regretting it was not a stranger she could bully and vent her spleen on to her heart's content. In the distance, I could see old Miss Townsend arrived. She had been blacklisted by another famous shipping line because of her utterly unreasonable behaviour and her demoralising effect on other passengers. She began by demanding mirrors everywhere and that the furniture in her luxurious stateroom should be changed at once.
Oh my God!
This is 1912. So, it's wonderful, isn't it? These descriptions.
She writes beautifully.
She does write beautifully.
That's verbatim, I guess. Is that? Yeah. Lovely.
This is just straight copies from her. From her journals.
Diary,
The next bit I want to read is there's lots more in there about the journey and the people she met, but I'd want to read the part where the ship hit the iceberg and her recollection of it. She had finished the night. She was sharing a cabin with her companion called Anne, who was also a stewardess. They didn't call passengers. They called them guests because this was a first class luxury.
It would be like a floating hotel.
Yeah. So she'd gone to bed. I composed myself to read my devotions. I pushed my magazines to one side and picked up my Bible. At the end, my Bible closed, I lay lazily reflecting on many things, comfortably drowsy. Crash. Then a low, rending, crunching, ripping sound. as Titanic shivered, and the sound of her engines gently ceased. Quiet, dead silence for a minute. Then doors opened and voices could be heard in gentle inquiry. Quietly restrained voices past our door answered just as quietly. I lay still. Not even to myself would I express what was in my mind. I must not show at that moment the ever-present fear that I had so successfully kept locked in my heart. Only once in an unguarded moment during a raging storm had that fear ever betrayed me, causing my pride pain from the jests and jeers of others afterwards. I waited for Anne to speak, for I knew she was awake. I looked over the side of my bunk at her, and she returned my look, saying in her calm way, for all the world, as if she were commenting on eggs and bacon, "Sounds as if something has happened." I suddenly wanted to roar with laughter at her unconscious placidity. Something has happened. She could hear as well as I could that they had started to draw the ship's fires, though neither of us commented on this ominous fact. And then she talks about...
started to what? To draw the ship's fires?
Fires, yes. I don't know what that means, but... because I suppose it was coal. Would it have been coal?
Coal-fired, probably.
Coal-fired, yeah.
Yeah.
Suddenly there was movement. Men were returning to duty that had recently gone to bed. I realised too that I must hasten on duty, for I had quite a number of women in my section. I said to you earlier that must have been an unusual career for a woman in those early years, but I suppose those ladies that she described there, there's no way they would have allowed a male steward in their cabin, probably, unless they were inviting them in. So maybe that's why they had, lady stewardesses.
Yeah.
Good old faithful Stanley, one of my bedroom stewards, came knocking at the door, his face whiter than usual, as he remarked casually, "I'm calling all our people, sister." He always addressed me as sister when we were alone. "Anything you'd like me to do for you on my way? You do know the ship is sinking." Sinking? The word repeated itself without fully entering my understanding as I finished putting on my uniform and quickly followed Stanley to our section.
Now, the whole Titanic thing was over a number of hours, wasn't it? So do you know how far that was?
She came across the band. I mean, she walked into one of the lounges, and the band were all getting ready to play some music to calm the nerves of the passengers, and that's historic fact. We know that the band was playing as the ship went down.
Well, it was in the movie, so it must be right.
There is talk they were playing, I think, Nearer My God to Thee, but I don't know whether that was what they were playing. But so she talks then about all the putting on life belts and all those kind of things. And we now know that she was asked to get on the lifeboat. And so I just want to jump forward a wee bit because time's just marching on a wee bit. I just want to read this bit here about when she's on the lifeboat and she's watching the Titanic. So we've got 1,500 people that were going to go down with the ship. 700 people were either in the sea or in lifeboats, and they survived. So, it was 2 to 1 against surviving. She says here, "My eyes never left the ship, as if by looking at it I could keep her afloat. I reflected that only 4 days ago I had wished to see her from afar." She always regretted that she could, because she was on the ship, she never had this image of the ship leaving port. She always wanted to see the ship she was on leaving, and she determined that one day she would be watching the ship from the shore leaving, and now here she was, my Titanic, magnificent queen of the ocean, a perfection of man's handiwork, her splendid lines outlined against the night, every light twinkling. I started unconsciously to count the decks by the rows of lights. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I stopped. Surely I had miscounted. I went over them again more carefully, hushing the whimpering baby meanwhile. No, I had made no mistake. There were only 5 decks now. Then I started all over again, and there were only 4. She was getting lower in the water. I could no longer deny it.
Wow.
As if all could read my mind, the women in the boat started to weep, some silently, some unrestrainedly. I closed my eyes and prayed for one and all, but dared not think of anyone in particular. I dared not visualize those people I had just left, warm and alive as I was. I tried to busy myself with the baby, but could not refrain from looking up again. Only 3 decks now, and still not a list to one side or the other. Desperately, I turned to where the other ship's lights shone on the horizon, because they'd seen lights on the horizon.
Right.
Surely they would be getting nearer by now. It was such a long, long time since we had first seen their comforting glow. But no, she didn't seem nearer. In fact, she seemed further away. And I think
That's right.
was the case, wasn't it? It was steaming
took
away
off,
from
yeah.
them. A tiny breeze, the first we had felt on this calm night, blew an icy blast across my face. It felt like a knife in its penetrating coldness. I sat paralysed with cold and misery as I watched Titanic give a lurch forward. One of the huge funnels toppled off like a cardboard model, falling into the sea with a fearful roar. A few cries came to us across the water, then silence, as the ship seemed to right herself like a hurt animal with a broken back. She settled for a few moments, but one more deck of lighted ports disappeared. Then she went down with a thundering roar of underwater explosions. Our proud ship, our beautiful Titanic, gone to her doom.
God. That's fabulous.
Yeah. She says, one awful moment of empty, misty blackness enveloped us in its loneliness. Then an unforgettable, agonizing cry went up from 1,500 despairing throats. A long wail and then silence, and our tiny craft tossing about at the mercy of the ice field.
Mm.
And unbelievably enough, 4 months later, she was on a hospital ship called the Britannic, and that was torpedoed.
Right.
She was put into a lifeboat, but the lifeboats were being sucked under the ship and were being churned up by the propellers. And she said it was an absolute massacre. She jumped out of the lifeboat, but ended up floating in the sea with limbs and heads and all sorts. She said it was just absolute carnage and most horrific thing she'd ever seen.
Mm.
This was only, I think, 4 years after Titanic.
I'm amazed she would want to go back to sea after the Titanic. I mean,
yeah, to me,
you
she's a
could count
hero.
yourself pretty lucky, I would think, but to want to go back out again.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. She's a hero to me, I think, just wonderful. And if someone said, who would you like to have at your table for dinner, she's a lady I would love to have sitting across the table from me.
Wouldn't she be fascinating?
So the book's called Titanic Survivor, the memoirs of Violet Jessop, stewardess. And thank you to her nieces for finding the manuscripts.
They're the ones that pulled it together. And has it been, I'm sorry to be negative, but has that diary, has that been substantiated? It is a correct
This is,
diary.
There's
it's
even
not just two women trying to make some money.
No, not at all. There's pictures, and there's even there's quite a lot of little bits inside. There's other drawings there you can see of actual documents that were included.
Right.
And it's basically word for word. They've modernised some of the words in it so people can understand it, but that's about all.
Right.
And they say here it's a true record of what she wrote. It's basically what she wrote. It's only been edited for spelling mistakes.
Wow, fascinating. But when did they do that?
1997. So it's reasonably new, considering this happened in 1912.
Yeah, waited
So
that
it
long.
was 65 years.
It's amazing that she never. I mean, people must have known that she was a survivor of the Titanic. She must have been interviewed over the years. And
Well, I don't know whether many people who survived the Titanic wanted to talk about it.
no.
I mean, the Titanic, I didn't know, nearly collided with another ship called the New York as it was leaving Southampton Harbour on this very first voyage, obviously. But she never ever mentions it in the book.
Right.
And they said it's odd that she never mentioned it because it would have been the talk of the ship. Heck, they hardly never even got out of the harbour. They would have had this collision. So,
That's right.
yeah. No, it's a great book.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you, Graham. That's excellent. What was it again?
Titanic Survivor by Violet Jessup.
Violet Jessup. Fantastic. Thanks, Graham. All right, well, I think that's enough from us today. We've actually gone over our time, so we'll be hung at dawn in a minute. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the show. Catch us again next week.